My name's Ava Reynolds. I'm 29 years old. Last night, at our family dinner, my parents slid a white envelope across the table, $150,000 for my adopted sister's new house. Then my dad turned to me and said, "You're the failure. We invest in winners." The air went still. I didn't cry. I just got up and walked out. Before I tell you what happened after that night, hit subscribe right now. Because if you've ever been treated like you weren't enough, the next few minutes will remind you why you are. That was the night I stopped chasing love and started building something my family would never see coming. But to understand how I got there, you need to know where this all began. You need to understand the architecture of abandonment, how it's built brick by brick, year by year, until you're living in a house made of other people's indifference. I was 7 when they brought Emma home. 7 years old, clutching my first place science fair ribbon, practically vibrating with excitement to show my parents what their daughter had accomplished. I burst through the front door, my voice echoing through the hallway. "Mom, Dad, I won. I actually won." But the house felt different. There was a stillness, an anticipation that made my victory feel suddenly small and insignificant. They were sitting in the living room with a little girl who looked like she'd been crying. She had these enormous brown eyes and blonde hair that caught the afternoon light streaming through our windows. My parents' faces were soft in a way I'd never seen before, tender, protective, completely absorbed. When I walked in with my ribbon, my mother barely glanced up. "That's nice, honey," she said, her voice distant and distracted. "Come meet your new sister, Emma." 8 years old, 2 years older than me, and somehow instantly more important than anything I had ever done or would ever do. She was adopted, they explained, needed extra love, extra attention, extra everything. And I stood there, still holding my ribbon, watching my parents transform into people I didn't recognize, people who cooed and fussed and promised this stranger the moon. That ribbon never made it to the refrigerator. It never made it anywhere. While Emma's participation certificates from her old school were carefully framed and hung in the hallway, my first place science fair victory disappeared into a drawer somewhere, forgotten like it never happened. That's when I learned the first rule of our house. Achievement meant nothing if you weren't the right kind of broken. If you've ever felt unseen in your own home, don't just watch, subscribe right now. Because nobody should disappear without being heard. The years that followed were a masterclass in emotional mathematics. Every smile they gave her was a smile taken from me. Every good job she received for ordinary things, cleaning her room, turning in homework on time, eating her vegetables, felt like another confirmation that I had to be extraordinary just to be noticed. And even then, it wasn't enough. I became a machine of accomplishment. Honor roll, expected, academic decathlon champion. That's nice, dear. Full scholarship to state university. Emma made varsity cheerleading. It didn't matter what I did or how well I did it. The equation never balanced. She could breathe and get applause. I could win the world and get a distracted nod. I remember one particular evening when I was 15. I'd just gotten my SAT scores back 1,000. 480 out of 1,000. 600. I was practically floating as I walked into the kitchen where my parents were helping Emma with her geometry homework. Basic geometry. Problems I could have solved in my sleep in 7th grade. But there they were, both of them, patiently explaining the same concept for the 4th time, while she twisted her hair around her finger and said she just didn't get it. "Mom," I said, trying to keep the excitement from my voice, because I'd learned that enthusiasm made them uncomfortable when it came from me. I got my SAT scores. My mother said, not looking up from Emma's worksheet. "That's nice, sweetheart." 1,480, I said, a little louder. My father finally glanced up. "Good for you, Ava." "Emma, see how if you move this angle over here? Good for me. Good for me." Like I'd told them I'd finished my laundry or remembered to feed the cat. Meanwhile, When Emma passed her driving test on the third try, they threw her a party. An actual party with balloons and a cake that said, "Congratulations, Emma," in frosting letters that probably cost more than my college application fees. I told myself one day they'd see me, but I didn't realize how much I'd have to lose to stop needing them. The pattern continued through high school, through college, through my early 20s. Every family gathering was another opportunity to watch them celebrate her mediocrity, while my achievements became background noise. When I graduated summa cum laude, they missed the ceremony because Emma had a cold. When I got my first job at a prestigious marketing firm, they spent dinner talking about how brave Emma was for trying out for community theater, and I kept trying. God help me, I kept trying to earn something that was never for sale. Love in our house wasn't about being worthy, it was about being wounded in the right way. Emma needed saving, and they were heroes for saving her. I needed nothing, apparently, so I got nothing. The dinner last night wasn't the first time money had been the measuring stick. Over the years, I'd watched them pay for Emma's car, her apartment deposit, her credit card debt, her failed business ventures. When she dropped out of college junior year to find herself, they funded a year-long trip to Europe. When I asked for help with a down payment on a condo, they told me it would be good for me to learn financial responsibility. But this $150,000 check, this was different. This wasn't just favoritism anymore. This was a declaration, a final judgment rendered after 22 years of evidence. I walked into that dining room last night thinking it was just another family dinner, just another opportunity to sit quietly while they praised Emma for something ordinary and ignored something extraordinary about me. I'd gotten a promotion at work, a significant one, and I'd been foolish enough to think maybe this time would be different. Maybe this time they'd be proud. The check was already on the table when I arrived. White envelope, my mother's careful handwriting, for Emma's new beginning. I sat down, and my stomach clenched in that familiar way it always did in their house, that anticipation of disappointment, that bracing for impact. "We have some exciting news," my father said, his voice warm in a way it never was when he spoke to me. "We're able to help Emma with her house purchase." Emma actually squealed like a teenager who'd just been asked to prom. "I can't believe it. This is really happening." She threw her arms around my mother, who laughed and squeezed her back. "How much?" I asked, though I already knew I didn't want to hear the answer. $150,000, my mother said proudly, "for the down payment and closing costs. We want to make sure she gets started on the right foot." I felt something crack inside my chest. Not break that had happened years ago. This was different. This was the sound of the last piece of hope. I didn't even know I was still carrying, finally giving up. That's wonderful," I managed, "because that's what you do. That's what the family disappointment does. You smile and you nod and you pretend your heart isn't bleeding all over their white tablecloth." But then my father looked at me with those cold, calculating eyes that had never once looked at me with warmth, and he said, "You probably think this is unfair." I didn't answer. I couldn't. My throat felt like it was closing. "The difference is," he continued, "Emma appreciates what we give her. Emma knows how to be grateful. You've always been so independent, so determined to prove you don't need anyone. Well, congratulations. You don't need anyone, and no one needs you." The words hit like physical blows, each one carefully chosen, perfectly aimed. This wasn't anger speaking. This was calculation. This was planned. "You're the failure," he said, his voice steady and sure. "We invest in winners." The silence that followed was absolute. I could hear the grandfather clock in the hallway, the hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen, the sound of my own breathing. Emma was staring at her hands. My mother was examining her wine glass like it held the secrets of the universe. And I realized, sitting there in that awful quiet, that this was the moment. This was the moment I'd been building toward my entire life without knowing it. All those years of trying, of hoping, of believing that maybe if I just achieved a little more, loved a little harder, needed a little less, they might finally see me as worthy of their love. They thought cutting me off would break me, but all it did was light a fire I didn't know I had. I stood up. My legs felt unsteady, but I stood up anyway. I looked at each of them, my father with his smug satisfaction, my mother with her careful avoidance, Emma with her guilt-stricken silence, and I realized I had nothing to say to any of them. No grand speech, no dramatic declaration, no tearful goodbye. They weren't worth my words anymore. I walked out of that house, out of that life, out of that version of myself that still believed love could be earned through suffering. But I had no idea the universe wasn't done testing me yet. The next 3 months were a descent into a kind of hell I didn't know existed. I'd always prided myself on my independence, my strength, my ability to survive anything. But surviving emotional abandonment and surviving actual abandonment turned out to be two very different skills. 2 weeks after the dinner, my company announced layoffs. 23 people, including me. Budget cuts, they said. Last hired, first fired, they said. Nothing personal, they said. But when you're already drowning, every wave feels personal. I sent out resume after resume. I went to interview after interview. I smiled and nodded and pretended I wasn't dying inside when they told me they'd chosen someone else. Overqualified, some said. Not quite the right fit, said others. What they meant was, something's wrong with you, and we can smell it. My savings dwindled. My confidence evaporated. My carefully constructed life crumbled piece by piece until I was living on ramen noodles and false hope, checking my phone obsessively for calls that never came. And through it all, my family's silence was deafening. Not a call, not a text, not even a passive-aggressive Facebook comment. I'd been erased so completely that sometimes I wondered if I'd imagined the entire 29 years of my existence. Then one evening, when I was at my absolute lowest, when I was seriously considering moving back to my college town and starting over completely, I made the mistake of opening Instagram. There it was, glowing on my phone screen like a middle finger from the universe. Emma's new house. The photos were professional quality staged furniture, perfect lighting, champagne glasses catching the golden hour sunlight. She looked radiant in every shot, glowing with happiness and gratitude and all the things I'd never been allowed to feel in my parents' presence. The caption made my stomach turn. So grateful to my amazing family for making this dream come true. Home sweet home, number blessed, number family love, number grateful, number new beginnings. The comments were a parade of congratulations and heart-eye emojis. Friends, relatives, strangers, all celebrating her good fortune, her loving family, her wonderful life. My wonderful life, I realized. The life I'd been trying to earn for 29 years, handed to her on a silver platter just for existing. I closed the app and sat in my dark apartment, surrounded by moving boxes I couldn't afford to fill, staring at walls that would never be mine. And for the first time since that dinner, I cried. Not the clean, cathartic tears of movies, but ugly, choking sobs that came from a place so deep I didn't know it existed. Maybe Dad was right, I whispered to my empty apartment. Maybe I really am the failure. The words hung in the air like a verdict. Maybe I was too proud, too stubborn, too broken to accept love. Maybe there was something fundamentally wrong with me that everyone could see except me. Maybe I'd been fighting a losing battle my entire life, trying to prove I was worthy of something I was never meant to have. But fate doesn't always hand you a second chance. Sometimes it waits for you to build it. The answer came 3 days later in the form of a handwritten sign in a coffee shop window. Help wanted, someone who cares. It was such a simple message, but something about those 4 words, someone who cares, reached through all my defenses and grabbed my heart. The coffee shop was called The Daily Grind, and it looked like it had seen better decades. The paint was peeling, the floors were scuffed, and half the light fixtures were burned out. But there was something about the place that felt real in a way nothing in my life had felt real for months. The owner was Maria Santos, a woman in her 60s with silver-streaked hair and eyes that had seen everything but still chose kindness. She looked at my resume, all those impressive credentials and accomplishments, and then looked at me. Really looked at me, in a way no one had in longer than I could remember. "You're overqualified for this job," she said, echoing what I'd heard a dozen times before. "Maybe," I said, surprised by my own honesty. "But I'm also unemployed, heartbroken, and desperate for something real. If those are qualifications, then I'm perfect for this job." She smiled then, really smiled, and I felt something inside me that I'd thought was permanently broken start to flicker back to life. "When can you start?" Working at the daily grind was nothing like my corporate job. There were no performance reviews, no quarterly projections, no strategic initiatives. There were just people who needed coffee and a kind word, and somehow, after months of feeling invisible, helping them made me feel seen again. Maria taught me things they don't teach in business school. She taught me that success isn't always about climbing ladders, sometimes it's about building bridges. She taught me that fixing something broken can be more satisfying than creating something perfect. She taught me that being needed isn't the same as being used. "This place has good bones," she said one afternoon as we stood looking at the water-stained ceiling and cracked tile floors. "It just needs someone who can see past the damage to the potential underneath." She wasn't just talking about the coffee shop. Under Maria's guidance, I started small. Repainting the walls, replacing the broken tiles, fixing the temperamental espresso machine that made sounds like a dying animal. Every repair, every improvement, every small victory felt like I was rebuilding more than just a coffee shop. I was rebuilding myself. The work was hard and dirty and completely unglamorous. My hands were constantly stained with paint or grease or coffee grounds. My back ached from crawling around fixing pipes and electrical outlets. My clothes were ruined within the first week, and I'd never been happier. It was during the third week of renovations that I met Ethan. He came in looking for coffee and found me on my hands and knees, wrestling with a stubborn baseboard that refused to line up properly. I was covered in sawdust. My hair was falling out of its ponytail, and I was muttering very unprofessional things about whoever had installed the original trim. "Excuse me," he said in a voice that was quiet but somehow carried perfectly across the empty space. "Are you open?" I looked up from my battle with the baseboard and saw him standing in the doorway, like he wasn't quite sure he should be there. He was tall and lean with dark hair that looked like he'd been running his hands through it, and he had the kind of eyes that seemed to see everything without judging any of it. "For coffee?" "Not really," I said, pushing a strand of hair out of my face and probably leaving a streak of sawdust behind. "For conversation with someone who's slowly losing her mind to home improvement?" "Absolutely." He smiled then, and something about that smile made the knot in my chest that had been there for months start to loosen. "I'm an engineer," he said. "Maybe I could help?" That's how I met Ethan Reed. Not at a party or through friends or on some dating app, but covered in sawdust on the floor of a broken coffee shop, too tired to pretend to be anyone other than exactly who I was. And somehow, miraculously, that was enough for him. He spent the next 3 hours helping me with the trim, and when we were done, the baseboard was perfectly aligned and I was completely smitten. He had gentle hands and a patient manner and a way of explaining things that never made me feel stupid for not knowing them already. "You've got good instincts," he said as we stood back to admire our work. "This place is going to be beautiful when you're done with it." "It's not mine," I said automatically, because that's what I'd been trained to say. Don't claim credit. Don't take up space. Don't assume you deserve beautiful things. "Isn't it?" he asked, looking around at all the work I'd already done. "Looks like yours to me." And in that moment, I realized he was right. This was mine, not because I owned it, but because I'd earned it. Every scraped knuckle, every aching muscle, every small victory had been purchased with my own sweat and determination. This was what belonging felt like. Ethan started coming by regularly after that. Sometimes to help with projects, sometimes just to drink coffee and talk. He never asked about my family or my past or why I'd ended up renovating a coffee shop instead of climbing corporate ladders. He seemed to understand instinctively that I was someone trying to build a new life, and he respected the construction zone. But slowly, carefully, I started to tell him pieces of my story. Not the whole ugly truth at first, just fragments. How I'd been laid off, how I'd needed a change, how working with my hands felt different than working with spreadsheets. He listened without trying to fix anything or offer advice or tell me how I should feel. He just listened, and somehow that was exactly what I needed. I used to design bridges, he told me one evening, as we sat in the coffee shop after closing, surrounded by paint cans and drop cloths. There's something satisfying about building something that connects two places that couldn't reach each other before. Is that what we're doing here? I asked. Building a bridge? Maybe, he said. Or maybe we're just building something worth crossing a bridge to find. If you've ever felt like you're running out of chances, subscribe now. Because missing what happens next might make you miss the proof that you were always capable. As the coffee shop transformation continued, something else started taking shape in my mind. It began as just a daydream, a fantasy I'd indulge in during break times or while I was waiting for paint to dry. But the more I thought about it, the more real it became. A house. Not just any house, but a house that was entirely mine, built exactly the way I wanted it, in exactly the place I chose, funded entirely by my own work and determination. A house that no one could take away from me or use as proof of my unworthiness. I started sketching during slow periods at the coffee shop. Nothing fancy, just rough drawings of what I imagined. A small place, maybe a cabin, somewhere with a view, somewhere peaceful, somewhere that felt like the opposite of my childhood home, which had always felt like a museum where I was an unwelcome visitor. Ethan found me drawing one afternoon and asked to see. I was embarrassed. My sketches were amateur and probably unrealistic, but something about his presence made me brave. "This is beautiful," he said, studying my rough plans. "Where are you thinking of building?" "Oh, I'm not actually building anything," I said quickly. "It's just wishful thinking." "Why?" The question was so simple, but I couldn't answer it. Why wasn't I building it? I had some savings. I had skills now that I didn't have 6 months ago. I had Maria's blessing to work flexible hours. What was stopping me except the voice in my head that sounded suspiciously like my father, telling me I didn't deserve beautiful things? "I don't know," I admitted. "I do," Ethan said quietly. "You're scared that if you build something you really want, someone might try to take it away from you." The accuracy of his observation took my breath away. That was exactly what I was afraid of. I'd spent so many years having my achievements minimized or ignored that the idea of creating something that could be celebrated or envied felt terrifying. "What if they do?" I whispered. "Then you build it anyway," he said. "Because the alternative is building nothing. And that's not really living." That conversation changed everything. Within a week, I'd found a piece of land about an hour outside the city. It wasn't much, just 2 acres of scrubby hillside overlooking the ocean, but it was mine. The first thing I'd ever owned that no one else had chosen for me, paid for, or influenced in any way. Ethan offered to help with the engineering and design work, and I accepted, not because I needed saving, but because I'd learned the difference between being rescued and being supported. He wasn't trying to fix my life, he was helping me build the one I wanted. We spent months planning, permitting, and preparing. Evenings after the coffee shop closed, weekends when the weather was good, any spare moment we could find. The house grew from my rough sketches into real blueprints, from blueprints into foundation holes, from foundation holes into something that looked like it might actually become a home. It was hard work, harder than anything I'd ever done. My soft office hands became calloused and scarred. My designer clothes were replaced with work boots and tool belts. I learned to read levels and mix concrete and frame walls that would actually stay standing. But every aching muscle, every scraped knuckle, every exhausted evening felt like victory. This was mine. Every nail I drove, every board I cut, every decision I made was proof that I was capable of creating something beautiful without anyone's permission or approval. The house rose slowly through the seasons. By winter, we had walls and a roof. By spring, we had electricity and plumbing. By summer, it was starting to look like the place I'd imagined in my coffee shop sketches. It wasn't a mansion. It wasn't impressive by my parents' standards. It was a simple cabin with large windows that faced the ocean, a wraparound porch perfect for watching sunsets, and a kitchen where I could make coffee and actually taste it without the bitter aftertaste of disappointment. But it was mine. Every square inch of it was mine. 1 year later, when I finally built my dream home, a silver BMW screeched to a stop outside my gate. I was on the porch, watching the sun set over the ocean, when I heard the car engine. Ethan was inside making dinner, and we'd been talking about maybe getting a dog to complete our little family of 2. It was a perfect evening, the kind that makes you grateful for every terrible thing that had to happen to get you to this moment. The silver BMW looked out of place on my dirt road, like a luxury item that had taken a wrong turn and ended up somewhere real. But I recognized it immediately. My stomach clenched in that familiar way, but this time it felt different. This time, I wasn't trapped in their house, sitting at their table, playing by their rules. Emma got out first, looking around with wide eyes like she'd stumbled onto an alien planet. She was wearing heels completely inappropriate for the terrain, and a white dress that probably cost more than my monthly food budget. She pulled out her phone immediately. "Dad!" I heard her say, her voice carrying clearly in the evening air. "You need to come here now. You're not going to believe this." My parents' car arrived 20 minutes later. Same pristine BMW, different license plate. They got out slowly, cautiously, like they were approaching a crime scene, which, in their minds, they probably were. I stayed on my porch, watching them take in my little piece of paradise. The house wasn't finished. There were still final touches to complete, landscaping to finish, details to refine. But it was undeniably beautiful. Even they couldn't deny that. My father's face went through several expressions in rapid succession: confusion, disbelief, anger, and finally something that looked almost like respect before hardening back into familiar disapproval. "Ava," my mother called out, her voice uncertain. We heard you were living out here." "I am," I called back, not moving from my chair. "This is my home." They approached the porch like diplomats entering enemy territory. Emma hung back, still on her phone, probably live tweeting the whole experience for her social media followers. "How?" my father demanded, and there was the familiar edge to his voice that used to make me shrink. "How did you afford this?" "I built it," I said simply. "That's impossible," he said. "You don't have any money. You don't have any skills. You don't have—" "I don't have you," I interrupted, and the words felt powerful in a way I'd never experienced before. Turns out that was exactly what I needed. Ethan appeared in the doorway then, drawn by the voices. He didn't say anything, just moved to stand behind my chair, one hand resting gently on my shoulder. It was a small gesture, but it said everything. I wasn't alone anymore, and I wasn't the same person who had walked out of their dining room a year ago. "Who's this?" my father asked, his tone suggesting that Ethan was some kind of contamination. "Someone who thinks I'm worth investing in," I said, reaching up to cover Ethan's hand with mine. "You did this to humiliate us," my father accused, his voice getting louder. "Built this thing to make us look bad." And that's when I realized how fundamentally he misunderstood everything. He thought this was about them. He thought my entire life, my struggles, my victories, my choices, were all somehow reactions to him and his opinions. He couldn't conceive of a world where his approval or disapproval was simply irrelevant. "No," I said, standing up slowly. I did this to survive you. The words hung in the air between us like a challenge. My mother's face crumpled slightly. Emma stopped texting and actually looked at me for the first time since they'd arrived. But my father's expression hardened further. We gave you everything, he said. You gave Emma everything, I corrected. You gave me a master class in earning love through achievement, and then moved the goalposts every time I got close. You never needed us, my mother said softly, and for the first time I heard something that might have been regret in her voice. You were always so independent, so capable. Emma needed more support. I was 7 years old when you decided I didn't need you, I said, my voice steady despite the hurricane of emotions in my chest. 7. And you know what? You were right. I didn't need you, but I wanted you. There's a difference. We stood there in the gathering dusk. 3 generations of women who had loved the same people and been damaged by them in different ways. Emma because she'd been taught that love was conditional on neediness. Me because I'd been taught that love was conditional on perfection. My mother because she'd been taught to love conditionally. We could start over, my mother said tentatively. Maybe we could try again. For a moment, I felt the old familiar pull. The desperate little girl inside me that had spent 29 years trying to earn their love perked up hopefully. Maybe this time would be different. Maybe they'd finally learned. Maybe I could have the family I'd always wanted. But then I looked around at what I'd built. The house that was mine, the man who loved me without conditions, the life I'd created from the ashes of their rejection, and I realized something that changed everything. I didn't want their love anymore. Not because I was bitter or angry or seeking revenge, but because I'd found something better. I'd found people who loved me, not despite my independence, but because of it. I'd found a place where my achievements were celebrated, not minimized. I'd found a family of my own choosing. No, I said quietly, I don't think so. But we're your family, Emma said, speaking for the first time since she'd arrived. No, I said, looking at Ethan and then back at them. You're my relatives. There's a difference. My father's face went purple with rage. After everything we did for you, everything you did for me? I laughed, and it came out harder than I intended. You gave her $150,000 for a house and told me I was a failure. You missed my college graduation. You forgot my birthday 3 years running. You never once, in 29 years, told me you were proud of me. We were proud of you, my mother said desperately. We just didn't think you needed to hear it. Everyone needs to hear it, I said. That's what love is. That's what family is. And I've learned what it feels like to have both. The silence stretched between us like a chasm that had taken years to dig and couldn't be crossed with apologies or good intentions. Revenge means I still care what you think, I said finally. I don't. It wasn't said with anger or bitterness. It was just a fact, spoken with the calm certainty of someone who had finally, completely, let go. They left as the last light was fading from the sky. No dramatic goodbyes, no slammed doors, no final confrontations. They just got in their expensive cars and drove back to their expensive lives, leaving me standing on my porch with the man who loved me and the home I'd built and the silence that finally felt like peace. That day, the silence between us finally felt like peace. 3 months later, a letter arrived. Handwritten, on my mother's personal stationery, forwarded through Maria at the coffee shop because they didn't have my address. I almost threw it away without reading it, but something made me pause. Dear Ava, it began. We realize we made mistakes. We're sorry. We hope someday you'll forgive us and let us be part of your life again. Love, Mom and Dad. It was everything I'd wanted to hear for 29 years, and it meant absolutely nothing to me. Not because I was holding grudges, but because I'd moved beyond needing their validation. I'd found something better than forgiveness. I'd found indifference. I folded the letter carefully and put it in a drawer. Not because I treasured it, but because someday I might need to remember how far I'd come. That afternoon, Ethan and I planted a tree beside the cabin. A oak sapling that would outlive us both, its roots reaching deep into soil that belonged to no one but us. As we patted the earth around its base, I thought about growth and time, and the strange ways that sometimes the worst things that happen to you turn out to be the best things in disguise. "Any regrets?" Ethan asked as we stood back to admire our work. I looked around at our little piece of paradise. The house we'd built with our own hands, the garden we were growing together, the life we were creating day by day. In the distance, I could hear the ocean, constant and reliable, and utterly indifferent to human drama. "Just one," I said. "What's that?" I wish I could go back and tell that 7-year-old girl with the science fair ribbon that she was already enough, that she didn't need to spend the next 22 years trying to earn something that was never for sale. What would you tell her instead? I thought about it for a long moment, watching the sun sink toward the horizon and paint the sky in colors that belonged to no one and everyone at the same time. "I'd tell her to build her own house," I said. "I'd tell her that sometimes the greatest gift someone can give you is their indifference, because it forces you to learn to love yourself. I'd tell her that family isn't about blood or obligation or shared last names. It's about people who celebrate your victories and mourn your losses and think you're worth investing in even when you can't pay them back. And then I'd tell her to plant a tree. The tree is bigger now. 3 years later, it's taller than I am. Its leaves changing with the seasons. Its roots growing deeper and stronger every year. Sometimes I sit beneath it in the evening and think about all the versions of myself I had to lose before I found the one worth keeping. They gave her $150K. They gave me silence. But silence became my foundation. Don't just scroll past someone else's ending, be part of one. Hit subscribe, because one day, when your story finally turns around, you'll want to know you weren't watching from the sidelines, you belonged to something real. The wind is picking up now, carrying the salt smell of the ocean and the green smell of growing things. Somewhere in the distance, I can hear Ethan working in the garden, probably arguing with the tomato plants about their reluctance to cooperate. The coffee shop is thriving under Maria's management and my weekend help. The tree is growing, the house is home, and I am finally, completely, enough. My name is Ava Reynolds. I'm 29 years old. I built a life that no one can take away from me, and I did it with the silence they gave me instead of love. It turns out that was exactly what I needed to learn, that love isn't something you earn, it's something you grow, like a tree, from the ground up, with patience and time, and the unshakable belief that you deserve to bloom. This is my story. This is what it sounds like when someone stops apologizing for taking up space and starts building a space worth taking up. This is what happens when you stop trying to fit into other people's definitions of success and start creating your own. The sun is setting now, painting everything gold and peaceful and perfect. And for the first time in my life, I belong exactly where I am.